You're listening to Psych with Mike. And remember, the book, Psych with Mike and Brett, A User's Guide to Being Human, has a ton more information in it that is corollary to the things that we talk about here on Psych with Mike. So pick up a copy and leave us a review on Amazon. That is super helpful. Subscribe to Psych with Mike on YouTube and on Apple Podcasts, and leave us a review on Apple if you would like, and that really helps out the show. And now, here's Psych with Mike. Welcome into the Psych with Mike library. I am your host, Dr. Michael Mahan, and last week I was talking about cognitive dissonance, or the human brain's difficulty being able to hold two conflicting thoughts simultaneously, and its association, connection, or cause of our everyday anxiety. If we look at anxiety along the dimensions of fear-based versus non-fear-based anxieties, then what we see is that non-fear-based anxieties are the result of the friction between conflicting thoughts that we hold in our brains, hence our cognitive dissonance. So whenever we have a cognitively dissonant thought, two thoughts that are conflicting, rubbing up against each other, the friction that those create are what human beings experience as anxiety. So one of the examples that I had used last time was if I am treating an adolescent male and he tells me, hey, I would really like to ask Sally out on a date, and then I say to him, well, why don't you go do that? And then he says, well, but I'm afraid that she might say no. So those are two conflicting thoughts. I want to ask this girl out on a date, but I'm afraid of rejection. Those thoughts are rubbing up against each other, and they're causing conflict, which is experienced by the individual as anxiety. Now, the only way to actually resolve that anxiety is to pick a side and be willing to live with the consequences. So I either ask Sally out and Sally says yes or no. That resolves my conflict over not asking her out. But then I have to be willing to live with the consequences. So if she says no, then I may be disappointed, but in reality, it's still a positive for the individual because now my mental resources are freed up so that I could go out and actually find someone who would be interested in being in a relationship with me. Now, a lot of times when that's happening in real life, it doesn't feel like that is advantageous, but in psychological terms, it actually is. If I'm only concentrated on the cognitive dissonance between asking Sally out and not asking her out, then I am draining my resources, which is going to make it very unlikely that I will ever pursue a different relationship or be able to see a relationship that might be offered to me that I might not otherwise be aware of. So resolving your cognitive dissonance is always better than living in the perpetual Schrodinger experiment that our lives tend to look like. But what I wanted to focus on today was this idea of fear-based versus non-fear-based anxiety. So if we look in the DSM-5 TR, the DSM-5 text revision, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the Social Sciences, it is the book that has all the psychological diagnoses in it. If we look under anxiety disorders, we see separation anxiety, specific phobias, social anxiety, panic disorders, generalized anxiety, substance or medication-induced anxiety, and anxiety due to other medical condition. So what we don't see in there are post-traumatic stress disorder or obsessive-compulsive disorder, which historically have been housed under the section on anxiety, but are no longer, because what we are learning is that there are differences in the ways that those anxieties, the PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder, the way that those operate. So even though those disorders may have a lot of anxiety in them, they themselves have been taken out of the anxiety disorders section and put in their own section. So obsessive compulsive disorders now appears under obsessive compulsive and related disorders. And post-traumatic stress disorder now appears under stress and trauma-related disorders. But there's still a lot of disorders that are under anxiety that probably are different than each other. So, for example, generalized anxiety disorder is going to almost always, I would say in every case, but I don't think we should ever use, or I should ever use, imperatives. But in every case of a generalized anxiety disorder, what is at the root of it is a cognitive dissonance. So two conflicting thoughts that are rubbing up against each other. So if I'm going to treat a generalized anxiety disorder, I want to identify the cognitive dissonance that's associated with that disorder and then help the individual to resolve that. And what I would recommend if you want more information about this specific topic is to pick up the book, Psych with Mike and Brett, A User's Guide to Being Human. And I very specifically detailed what I'm talking about here today in chapter 6 of the book. But you can find more information and then have that to be able to reread over and over again to help you understand what it is that we're talking about. But there are other disorders still under the anxiety disorders section that are more fear-based. So social phobias or specific phobias and other kinds of panic disorders are probably fear-based. Now, why is that important? Because if we look at the fear-based disorders, so let's talk about the fear-based disorders that have been separated out, because the reason they've been separated out is that there is new evidence that shows that they're different from other anxiety disorders. So post-traumatic stress disorder, what's different about that? Well, post-traumatic stress disorder now appears to be an error response or error correction mismessaging that happens in the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is an area at the base of the brain that is involved in creating memory and being able to recoup memory. So if I have an error correction in the hippocampus, then what that means is that I am more likely to be triggered by certain events in the environment, and that when those triggers happen, I'm much more prone to jump immediately to a fight or flight type response rather than being able to mediate on the information and say this information does not warrant a severe reaction, but that error detection problem is causing me to jump immediately into a very significant reactive state, which is what post-traumatic stress disorder is. Then an OCD appears to be an error correction or error miscorrection in the cingulate-opercular network, which is an error correction center that has to do with attention, with error monitoring, and in decision making. And that makes sense because in the obsessive compulsive disorder, I feel obsessed and compulsed or committed to this idea of specific behaviors that I engage in that ward off negative information being processed or my perception that some negative event is going to happen. So I have to, for example, leave all of the cabinet doors open in a specific area of my home, let's say the kitchen, a certain amount, or else something bad's going to happen. So that behavior acts as a talisman against that bad behavior or that bad occurrence, and that is happening because in this singular opercular network I'm having an error detection fault that's causing me to make these assumptions that this behavior is something that I need to engage in to allow myself to be safe. So in those fear-based anxieties, what's happening is that we have an error correction messaging problem rather than just a cognitive dissonance problem. And so when we think about those anxieties along that fear-based domain, then what we know is that those anxieties are different. It's important for us to recognize that, and we are beginning to do that more and more, and I think that that's going to continue to be the case, that more and more fear-based anxieties will be separated out from underneath the anxiety disorders tab and will find their own spaces in the DSM as we become better aware of what the actual mechanism is that is misfiring to cause those anxieties to be present. So specific phobias, is that a cognitive dissonance problem? If I'm afraid of spiders, is that because I want to like spiders, but then I'm afraid of probably not. There's probably some deep-seated fear of spiders that may even go back evolutionarily to something that happened in the distant past that we inherit even in our DNA. Now, if that's the case, then that is a fear-based anxiety that is operating differently than cognitive dissonance. So generalized anxiety disorder is always going to be about cognitive dissonance. The treatment is to figure out what the dissonance is and to try and help the individual to correct it. The fear-based anxieties have error correction issues that are causing us to feel overstimulated in a situation where that isn't necessarily needed. So remember, the book has more information, Psych with Mike and Brett, A User's Guide to Being Human. I am very, very interested in people giving me feedback, so please, please, please give me feedback as I am on my new journey without Mr. Brett Newcomb, and let me know what you would like to see in the show, what you like, what you don't like, people that you might want me to try and have a conversation with. Remember that the music that appears in Psych with Mike is written and performed by Mr. Benjamin DeClue, and if it's Friday, it's Psych with Mike.